So I'm here with Layman Pascal. This is like our maybe third or fourth conversation that we've recorded. And we're here to talk about your new course. So maybe I'll just say Layman is a chakra biopsychologist or something. Is that your primary? And you're also very good at plumbing, apparently. That's the rumor I have. Besides being a public speaker, a yoga teacher, a non-dualist theologian, all these things that you do, you're a man of many, including plumbing.
Yeah, it's actually, I mean, it's fantastic to be able to alternate between spiritual, intellectual, and physical activities. It's really, I mean, I don't necessarily want to have to fix the faucet, but at the same time, the day in which I fix the faucet and talk to John Vervaeke is better than the day where I just talked to John Vervaeke, if that makes sense.
You've got the whole spectrum of high abstract, heavenly, and the shit down below, which is what the spiritual path is all about, right? It's not just about the up here; it's about it's about the shit that we have, right?
Absolutely. Yep. The tree can only grow as high as its roots go down into the shit.
Yeah. I mean, I had a very good teacher once, and he could give these amazing teachings on Dharma. And then I remember him teaching me how to shovel properly. It's like he had the perfect technique. And so I trusted him because he was good at that. And he wasn't just a bullshitter like most of us are. I mean, speaking personally, not you, of course, but
he was a good shoveler and a bullshitter.
He was an excellent shoveler, probably a good plumber. I think the people who are the most, grounded spiritually are also the most practical and down to earth on some level. At least the people I've met who I've trusted the most on that level had those two qualities to them.
That there's something there that ties into the course, right? So
yeah,
I think we should talk about both my course, which is the Parallax Academy course I'll be doing in September, but also the Parallax Sangha, which has just started, and see if there's kind of overlaps between those two. But the one I'm doing is non-duality in the network age. I also call it separator is the connector, sometimes Deus ex mycelia, because it's sort of about how to think differently about and regenerate spirituality and live the forms of real religious practice, personally and in communion and in the weirdness of the world we're in, but in a way that conforms to like the networking and web-like structure that's now reality at all levels. So psychological networks, spiritual networks, neural networks, social networks, digital networks, obviously, that sort of bring this all home for us. But also the mycelial webs that are in the earth, right? These fungal networks that are decomposing everything and show us the basic forms of intelligence and communion. So like for all of that, it's the world we live in now. It's these branching structures, these branchable links, these separative connectors, which have a real analogous structure to the nature of non-duality, which doesn't remove the duality, but also understands the duality to be something that is inherently one. But it goes all the way down into the shit muck of the earth, all the way out into the technological domain that presences this for us in our technology, and all the way up to the spiritual domain as well. So I think that's what makes things is webs, connections, networks, relationality, interconnectivity. That's the form that all these things have in common now. And let's dig into that stuff.
So it's a different way of looking at hierarchy in a sense. It's not a pyramid of going up. It's networked up and down. And so up and down become kind of less, let's say less like a ladder. Is that am I understanding the mycelian network? I've been hearing this kind of metaphor a lot. I think it comes from Deleuze and things like that.
Well, you're talking about this guy who you have trust in, not only because he has spiritual insights, but also because he's a good shoveler.
Yeah.
The credibility is not coming from the fact that he has official status at the top of a hierarchical pyramid. The credibility is coming from the fact that multiple internal functional networks that relate him to the world are connected. They're conjoined. They've grown into each other in himself, his shoveling part and his spiritual part and his human part. These are all intertwined. And so this interconnectivity gives a credibility that we used to look to status for.
Right, right. So that's an interesting thing. What is spiritual status, and how do we judge? You know, I asked you this question as a kind of a joke, and I said, "Are you a guru?" And I liked your answer. You said yes. At least that you were aware of. Maybe there's a part of us that has an expertise, or that is, you know, that is wise, and then there's a part of us that's, you know, kind of dumb, and kind of, we have all these different parts of us. And so it seems like your spiritual system is that you're trying to address many different kind of levels of experience and understanding. And how do you balance all of those things? This is the one thing I've been thinking about, the one and the many. I was thinking about when I used to practice Zen, it was very simple and very rich because of its simplicity. You just did one thing. You sat and walked and eat, and you chop wood, and you wash dishes, and you do basic things, and it's very profound and rich. But then there's other traditions where you have all these different levels. And so where do you situate yourself on this? You seem to be working on many levels at the same time. Yeah.
Well, I think we all are, if we take our experience seriously, right? Like just interacting with each other in the world brings up different dimensions. And if we don't reject any of them or try to, you know, lay some weird trip on them, if we just take them seriously and try to get better at them, then we naturally have a flow of multidimensionality. But I think it's always there. Like you were talking about, Zen simplicity kind of focuses you in a singular way, but it does that in a way that allows you to do all those different things with that singularity, right? You're walking, chopping wood, you're eating. I just came from a week at a Zen monastery where we did this wisdom retreat, and people are doing all the things of life, but they're just doing them with this Zen singularity. So you're always getting the many and the one together. In every system, you might start emphasizing the many, but be discovering its oneness. You might start emphasizing the oneness and discovering the manyness. But if it's authentic and you're living and experiencing and thinking and not shutting anything off, then eventually you're converging around this point where you have one manyness or many oneness or something like that. And I think that's when I say the separator is the connector, that basic structure, that when you have two, when you have divergence, you also have something in common. If we're distinguished from each other, we're relationally different. That's something we have in common. That makes us the same. We're the same enough to be different and different enough to be the same. So I think that kind of non-dual logic is essential for understanding all spiritual practices, because they're always bringing the many and the one together. But it's also essential for understanding how networks operate, because a network is always based on links, and a link is something that makes separate things the same.
The same, and yet retaining their distinctness. On some. So it's not a sameness. You know, it's not a bland sameness. It's not a bland oneness, and it's not complete fragmentation either. It's one and two, or something like that.
That's why I like to emphasize this old-fashioned word, non-duality, because we're talking about being not two. That's different than talking about being two or being one. We're talking about a condition where the difference between being one and being two doesn't quite apply, where they both apply and they're both not quite enough. And I think that's the natural extension of starting to see that we live in a world of webs and networks, which in turn is a natural extension of using network technology as our basic information interface with reality. So I think we're going to, as we move further and further into a bioelectronic age, we're going to see more and more parts of reality showing up to us as reciprocal interconnectivity, link-like, web-like structures. And so we have to attune ourselves and our spirituality and our religiosity to that pattern. And we have to start thinking about, and that's what this course is going to be doing through September, thinking about doing practices, but also co-enacting with the participants some kind of new phrasing of wisdom that's appropriate to that techno-social structure, to this world historical moment.
Okay, well, let's get into your course, and this is your second module, right? So I'm wondering about you know, what happened in the first course for you. What was the takeaway from that? then what do you hope to achieve in this next course with people? What are we trying to do here?
Yeah, great question.
I say we because I think I'm doing a similar thing in a different modality, but I think it's in many ways the same thing that I'm trying to achieve as you are with our Parallax Sangha.
Yeah,
activity.
and there's a couple of different ways to look at that. I mean, we're trying to achieve something for ourselves. We're trying to achieve something for Parallax, and we're also trying to achieve something for the participants in maybe the greater world.
Yes.
The one that the course that I did for Parallax in the spring really showed me that people were excited to try a lot of variations of practices. So when you bring out a principle of inner practice and life of practice, which can be interior or interpersonal, it's nice to get the concept and then try several variations and have the time to check with yourself and see which one works for you. Because if we're trying to build up an ecology of practices, you can't just take somebody's practice for granted. You've got to explore the variations and find what works best for your organism. So I think people liked that. I think there was requests for more social, collective, interpersonal work. So we've made the courses a little longer. So in each session, we can get to some discussion, some practice, and some group sharing. But we've also added these fireside chats for people that want to add that on to the course, where there can be a more free socializing around these themes. If there's areas people want to go into or practices they've tried or questions they have that aren't really part of the course material, because it seemed like there was a lot of thirst for this collective dimension, for trying to set up new rituals, for experimenting with in-person events, for building trust, doing shadow work with each other, and trying to bring forth collective intelligence and maybe collective sapience more richly.
Yeah.
So
would you say that you're working towards building a community of practitioners here? Or is that one of your goals?
My goal is not to have like my community of practitioners.
Yeah.
But my goal is to have like an echelon of people, a meta community of practitioners who can work together and also have their own communities, who would be able to institute real practices that are transformational for people and that can build sacred culture and do it in a way that's appropriate to what we know now about the nature of the human being and the world, and that fits in with the technological and cultural and essentially electronic dimension of the world we live in. So we're trying to build up, let's say, a caste of people in the most general sense.
I like that, a caste.
Really embodying meaning to the point, and embodying meaning not just in the sense of I have a great narrative that gives my life meaning, but embodying meaning in terms of I'm doing practices every day that give me an enhanced sense of meaning, and I understand those practices and I can help other people improvise their own practices. And also we can get together and collaboratively form communities, whether they're short-term or long-term, that give us an intense sense of shared coherent meaningfulness that we need in order to bond together, and that we all need collectively in order to face the existential risks that are, looming over the digital age now.
Yeah. So you suggested we talk a little bit about Parallax Sangha, so which is the name of a new group that I'm starting with Owen Cox, which is actually an old group, what we had that used to be called the Manifesto Media Academy, that came out of our men's work, kind of a men's group, and so we're a bunch of friends, and we started, and we wanted to do something new, and we called it Parallax Sangha. We're let's say culturally appropriating a Buddhist word, because I'm a formal Buddhist, but many people in the group aren't, and I have no interest in proselytizing Buddhism to people. This is what I like about Buddhism, is that it doesn't want to do that really, but I called it a Sangha, which is a traditional word, and then it's called Parallax Sangha. So I think the idea was to make it, let's say, both rooted in tradition, in at least language-wise tradition, and also something that is that is up to date with the modern world. And then there's something that people have been talking about a lot. This phrase, the Sangha is the next Buddha is the Sangha, and I part of me is like, no, that I don't agree with that. I think you still have to have the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. In other words, you still have to have leaders, and you still have to have a community, and you have to have, axioms, teachings that are true. And but on the other hand, there does seem to be this kind of groups of people who aren't members of any formal religion and would like to get together and play around with this. So what are let's say, I guess my question is about a community. What do you think the pitfalls of that, and what are the advantages of it, of taking all of these different techniques, meditation techniques, somatic techniques, psychological techniques, and finding an ecosystem that is coherent, that isn't just a bunch of techniques? And how do we do that?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's part of what Peter Limberg is looking at on the Stoa with the practice problem. I just did an interview about that yesterday, because there's a sense in which we have to develop an ecology of practices. And how do we do that outside of inherited traditions?
Yeah.
And then I think it's important to realize that the inherited traditions, whether they come down for thousands of years or some impressive guy made them up 50 years ago, in either case, we don't actually know whether that ecology of practices works really well together and has viability in the world we're going into. It's experimental. We're gambling with it to some degree. We're taking an existential risk ourselves. So no matter what we're looking at, whether we're looking at, I'm going to join this Buddhist lineage, or I'm going to join this Rajneesh community, or I'm going to try to invent my own practices and gather with other people, we've got to have a really experimental outlook, which means we have to be willing to try things. We have to have the space to discuss variations, and we have to have some methodology for evaluating whether those things are working or not, and at different time scales.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is an ethos in which we know we're experimenting, because nobody can come in and stipulate to everyone's satisfaction that these practices will work really well together and take care of your whole life. So we've got to unpack them. We've got to be able to experiment, but we've also got to be looking for the basic underlying skills that allow us to do that well. I think one of those is mutual respect and having good integrity with other practitioners. One of those is somatic interoception, right? I think if people have the ability to sense with other parts of themselves how they're going through the practice and how they're relating to other people, then they have a much higher likelihood of being able to correctly evaluate whether it's working out or not, and maybe can get the jump on some of these things. I think there's a great question. I don't know if you've experimented with permaculture at all, but one of the principles of permaculture that's always interested me is this idea that you plant not a single plant, but these clusters of plants that have to be appropriate to the niche ecologically. But maybe you need a plant with a shallow root system, a mid-range root system, and a deep root system, so they can all work together as a team. So you think, oh, if I was developing an ecology of practices, I should at the very least be thinking not about the practices themselves, but about the combinations of practices that might counteract each other. So if you had a community space in which people had integrity and would come together in collective intelligence building exercises, and also had in the front of their mind, which combinations of practices are we trying, and how is that landing for me, and what are the results, and they could share that information around, then I think over a little while, they would pretty quickly build up the capacity to navigate well towards the ecology they're trying to produce.
So but there's the individual ecology, what practices you do on your own, and then there's the collective practices you do with other people. Are you going to work on that as well, or I mean, there's
absolutely
collective.
We're trying to build a little more space for that in, right? And that's once the dialogos or collective group flow gets started, it sort of has its own rhythm. So you want to give it a little extra time, and part of that is everybody getting to know each other and building trust. We'll see how much shadow work might be involved in that, because there's levels of trusting each other. Part of that is communicating around a common theme and a common aspiration, right? That's what in the Andrew Cohen attempts to create collective intelligence. He's focused very much on putting aside egotism and trying to relate from our authentic selves to our sort of evolutionary aspirational state. I think that's important, but it's not the only important one, because we do have to do sort of psychotherapeutic sharing. I think it's very important. I constantly point this out to people, and it astonishes me how difficult it is to instantiate. We have to be able to share from subconscious and irrational and nonlinear parts of ourselves as well. So I just came from a really successful wisdom retreat, very high level people. But still, all of the things where they try to get us to have group flow and group cohesiveness would be asking people consciously to share something that's coming up for them in various ways. And it's coming up to the part of them that makes sense of things. You go, oh, I think this reminds me of this, or this really makes me think of this. And there's very little asking of people to say something that you don't understand and you don't know what it means. Right? If we were to go back and forth a few times, sharing things only that we didn't understand, that felt like maybe they were part of this, but I have no idea why I'm sharing it. That would open up potentially some subconscious pathways for collective resonance. Right? So I think part of the idea is to get beyond just using the front of the mind as the locus for establishing group coherence and start to add in more layers. And those layers will inherently be somewhat unpredictable and not fully making sense to the part that normally does the sharing.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were mentioning Andrew Cohen, I was wondering why his community went so dark, right? You know, and perhaps that was one of the reasons that they didn't go through that particular psychotherapeutic stage. I was also listening to somebody named Robert Johnson, who's a Jungian, and he talked about how Krishnamurti, he was a student of Krishnamurti, and he got really angry at Krishnamurti because Krishnamurti kept yelling at everybody and saying, just, you know, be aware, right? And he didn't know what that meant. So he had to go through this whole process, like 60 years before he understood what he meant. And he said that often teachers give you this absolute and say, try to embody that, but that's not where the person is at in their you know, in their journey. And so there has to be again, this is why it's important perhaps to at least be, you know, like if I'm doing coaching or something and we're working on dreams, it seems to be the thing that for me personally that gets us to a different level, because if you're just talking on the propositional level, you can give all the good advice in the world. But the person might be bound by some psychic energy that is not so propositional and not so easy to define. And when you go into the dream world and you go into the, you know, body world and the somatic world and all these different worlds, then it can liberate energy. Because it takes a lot of, I think, energy to do spiritual practice, and often people are just caught in the initial stages of it because they're trying to realize the absolute or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a couple of ways in which energy gets squandered and prevents it from being available for our spiritual deepening, both in terms of our internal networking and in terms of our interpersonal networking. And I think they're both important. There will always be a role for exceptional individuals who specialize in certain capacities and communities, but the ability of sanghas to become more intelligent and more powerful and wiser is going to play a huge role as we go forward into an information interlinking culture, because that's the primary example, I think, in human civilization of information interlinking. Our sanghas, our dharma fields of various kinds. That's where we need people to be establishing collective intelligence the most. And in order to do that, they have to be able to liberate a lot of energies in themselves.
Yeah.
And that gets shut down partly because of our own attitudes, right? The things I'm really trying to do, the very fact that I'm trying can sometimes be an inhibition on my capacity to freely function and develop and cultivate myself. Sometimes there's a social dynamic that even when there's a leader, and even when that leader has good reason to sort of push you and demand things a little bit, there's also a tremendous possibility for overt and covert social dynamics to hold people back, to hold them in the form of that relationship, which
all kinds
doesn't
of projections and Oedipal issues and things like that, which come up.
and just who gets to share which things in which contexts, and who's allowed to challenge who. And these dynamics are worth inquiring into, because it's unsatisfying in some ways for both parties, for like a teacher and a student, but then also for everyone who's a member of a community, to not have those really rich relationships, because in some ways it's the richness and depth of the exchange, coming back to this network model that we're going to feature in the course. The richness of the two-way reciprocal exchange is what allows the Dharma to be co-generated, right? And student guru is one special example of a link, but all kinds of relationships can be links of this kind. And we need to look at those basic dynamics and be comfortable both holding ourselves to our best selves, but also comfortable opening up and sharing and relaxing ourselves out of the pre-established forms of the inherited, somewhat out of date social forms that don't let us get this enriching two-way participation that I think we're going to increasingly envision as the center of Dharma production going forward.
Yeah. I was talking to Cadell last night about, the Jewish model where you have the rabbi and you sit around the table with the bottle of wine and some okay food, and then you get down to business and discuss matters of the heart, things that really are important. And I said that that's this convivial model. I'm using the word conviviality from Ivan Illich, who wrote this book called Tools for Conviviality, and it's always been my kind of the thing that I think is necessary in a community is this conviviality, a warmth between the people. So I guess my question is how to keep that. And Cadell sort of pushed back and said, "Oh, yeah, but a bunch of people talking around the table, that's a nightmare unless you have a sacred purpose in what you're doing and why to do that." So how to keep the warmth and conviviality and the sacred purpose in a sangha or in a sacred community?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to approach that. When it's a physically embodied community, but to some degree we can do this digitally. If you set up the context of the space on purpose to be sacred in its orientation, that already goes a long way. As well as the question of who do you let into which convivial space, right? Conviviality is a very good general principle, but there's a different conviviality between the Zen master on the street and the Zen master who's allowed a few students to come over, or between the way the rabbi presents at the synagogue and the way the rabbi presents and who he invites to the having wine.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah.
So there's, one of the things we're doing with this course is, first of all, the principle of the course, the orientation is toward the sacred, to the religious, the spiritual, the non-dual, the personal and interpersonal transformation. So it's already setting up a space that's distinct from ordinary mundane interactions. Second of all, there's a selection and a self-selection of getting people who are already oriented toward that. Yeah. Right. So it's not fundamentally dramatic, right? It's not some huge cut in the population, but you're only choosing a few people and you're giving them a context. And then given that, you have to continue to reorient each other in that context back to the sacred. Now, ritual can help us do that, but also just constantly bringing it up can remind us to do that.
Yeah, I like, you're familiar with Lee Lozovic and his Sangha. Yeah. And what they had this thing, they called it the bordel, where you get together and in the end of the evening and you'd share food and they would call it in the Hindu tradition, they would call it remembering the divine. And so people kind of get together and they tell stories, but then you can tell the difference between the story that's just banal. It's just like, okay, what did I do yesterday? Or how to, and the story that is really has something to do with the sacred. Like there's a difference that you have to tune into, I think.
Yeah, the sacred is more than anything else, it's a mode of participation that's available to us. It's like going into our erotic mode, going into our sacred mode, and then projecting that sacredness onto things. But also it's a mode we go into, we get turned on to our sacred mode by some of the symbols and stimuli of the sacred.
Mhm.
And the symbols can be visual, they can be contextual, they can be discursive, they can be anchored in ritual. And if there's an idea of, hey, we're coming together for a sacred gathering, then everybody's already activating that stimulation pattern in themselves.
Mhm.
As long as we can keep touching it in. And one of the big dangers, of course, are individuals who go into they start trying to be sacred and they go sideways into a huge, long personal narrative.
Yeah.
And you can understand they're trying, but at the same time, it's bringing down everyone else's experience of the field. So first of
Yes.
all, you're looking for people who aren't troubled by that tendency too much, but at the same
Mhm.
time, it's always going to come up for people. So we have
Yeah.
to be able to catch ourselves and to be able to tell each other later, like, hey, I thought maybe that went too far. You might want to watch that. Or also just create this feeling of the sacred that's rich enough that people feel that they're out of step with it when they start to go aside.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very good. And very important as well, to distinguish between, let's say, psychology and the sacred, like they're not the same thing. On the other hand, you have to work on yourself, and it's not always clear what are we doing the work, what Gurdjieff called the work, which isn't psychological work exactly precisely, even though it might include some psychological work.
Yeah, there's a tendency, I mean, we need, and this is one of the things when you're looking at ecologies of practice, spiritual practices that release us, spiritual practices that build up something in us, and
Mhm.
therapeutic practices that make us more aware of what the lived human condition is. These
Yeah.
are all important, right? They're plants that have to go with each other, but we have to figure out how to do that correctly, because the therapeutic temptation in our current society often deviates from the intentional practices we're doing spiritually. So one of the things about this course, anybody who's watching this is probably familiar with our friend Alexander Bard. So non-duality in the network age is in a way spiritual and religious practice suggestions for the kind of world that Bard and Soderquist are constantly pointing at.
Yeah.
But they're so interested in promulgating classic religious practices. They tend more often to point to sex, drugs, and psychoanalysis.
Yeah, this is what I wanted, exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, because I love Bard's sociology, when he defines tantra as sex, psychoanalysis, and pharmacology, I have a yes and a no. I was like, okay, yes, this is part of it, but I don't buy that as a definition of what tantra is. At least because perhaps I'm more acquainted with classical tantra traditions, and doesn't seem to me to be that. Although those maybe things are definitely modalities that we could work on in a tantric space. But would you agree with me there, or?
Yeah, it's I'm a big supporter of their work. But one of the subtitles Tom and I played around with was Beyond Sex, Drugs, and Psychoanalysis.
Yes, exactly. Beyond
There are
sex,
ways
drugs,
to
and
expand
psychoanalysis.
the meaning of those terms that would
Mhm.
satisfy us, but the conventional sense of those terms is a little bit limited compared to the great traditions, because
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
addition to that stuff, you also have to meditate, contemplate, pray, associate with spiritual figures, turn your
Mhm.
lived interoception into an academy, work on trance states, get better at group flow and appreciation and imaginal work, and love God, and go through remorse, right? And hold communion, and work on the logical puzzles of the koans. And there's all these other skill practices that are part
And
of the.
also, sorry to interrupt, but also I think that sexuality, psychoanalysis, and maybe an acid trip, that's a kick in the butt towards the transcendental. But then there is a beyond that. I mean, if you just keep doing that over and over again, you haven't got into the tantric realm yet. You're just, I don't think you're there yet. So in a way, I think of those things as sutric practices. I think of them as beginner practice. I mean, I think of those as they could move all the way from sutra through to tantra, but in the beginning, that's what they are. Like, at least from my experience, like psychedelics knocked me out in some kind of a way that allowed me to, get to the door, but I wouldn't want to keep taking them over and over again once I was in this is personal, but
yeah, that's right. I mean, it's
and then if I did take it, it might be once a year in a very sacred context, then that would be important, or twice a year. But as an activity in itself, I don't think they are tantric activities in themselves.
it's different for different people.
Indeed,
but
that's true. You're right.
You're
So
right.
I don't want
We
to.
need to think of them as sort of threshold activities. They can have a more sutric or a more tantric manifestation, but I would think of these as, say, 3 gargoyles at the threshold. Right.
That's good.
Yeah. An LSD trip is a great, it's a great promo video for like a vacation spot, but then you actually have to go to that vacation spot and live there and get to know it. For some people, that's going to involve more psychedelics and more sex and more psychoanalysis than for other people.
Yeah.
But all of those things have to open up into a whole spectrum of multidimensional embodied practices that we point to throughout the traditions, and we need to understand more clearly so that we can gather them together, test them out, and also improvise new ones, but things that really transform us over time, not just give us short-term hits.
Fully agreed. Yeah. And of course, those realms are vitally important realms that we have to look at, especially now. I mean, sexuality and psychedelics. And
if you think about the worlds that are co-enacted by those processes, right? If you think about the whole world of transcendental eros and the whole world that psychedelics point to, and the whole world of human maturation and deep transformation that psychoanalysis points to, then that's really something. But the way in which practices are conventionally instantiated could be as much of a limit as an opening.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so I'm fully on board with what you said there.
The other thing, speaking of Bard, that we want to look at in here is how do you make spiritual practices appropriate to the individual when they've so often been framed as something that the individual does? So if we take seriously this notion that we are relational, plural, interior network beings that are—
man is legion, as Gurdjieff would say.
Exactly. So if man is legion, how does a legion practice? As opposed to saying, okay, you're the self, witness the self that you are. Right? It doesn't mean there's no validity to a practice like that, but in order to make that practice consistent with the emerging world, we have to understand it as being a subset of the plurality of the self. Yeah.
And I mean, I always use the Gurdjieffian model because the 3 brain model, because it's so simple and so clear to me that's what we are. We're we have our conceptual mind, we have our emotional body, and then we have then we have the way we move in the world, a motility. So I always think that the practices are noticing. I mean, Gurdjieff was very good, and they're noticing that those parts of us are not working, together, and we don't even know what they are yet fully. And so we start with our basic ignorance of that, and then the work is to become more and more aware of those our three. He calls them the 3 brains. There's this triad, and then the unification of them. And I keep seeing this pattern also in another way that Bard talks about mythos, pathos, and logos again, and this is another triad that kind of maps onto that in some ways.
The first step is to understand that there are multiple parties connected informationally together, right? Those parties can be us. They can be worldviews, paradigms, parts of the society. They can also be aspects of our inner life. As long as we're under this is very Gurdjieffian, as long as you're under the normal delusion that that's all roughly the same single homogeneous entity, then you haven't even begun to inspect what the participants are. Once you've found participants, then you have to be mindful of how they're interacting. They might be getting along great, or they might be fighting each other. Those are both good. The mindfulness has to stay within the relational interaction. And that's
Yes.
as true for the people forming the Sangha as it is for the systems in ourselves. And if you just were to, this is one of Gurdjieff's great disciples was Jean de Salzman. People have various views about her, but the way she thought of the practice very clearly was you're tracking the disharmony between these systems, right? Which means you have to know about them and you have to attend to their informational interrelations, but you don't have to make them harmonize. You just have to stay there and watch their disharmonious interactions.
That's what Gurdjieff would call conscious suffering, right?
Absolutely. And by
in a way, yeah.
become the thing that harmonizes them by permitting yourself to witness the disharmonious interaction. But first of all, that requires knowing about the participants and feeling into interactivity.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think you called it relational patterns or something So
and there's also an ultimate version of that, just to come back to the non-duality, which is you can take that to the point, the Zen koan point, where that interaction is between sameness and difference, is how I would phrase it. And when you're watching the balance or imbalance between sameness or difference, like say in a puzzle where two things that are made to be the same and can't be the same at the same time, if you stay with that, there will be moments where the relational balance becomes exquisite, and suddenly your consciousness falls into that interactivity, and you are the connector. You're the link between the node of separateness and the node of sameness. And in that moment, you have an experience of the world existentially that is indistinguishable from what Satori points to.
Right. Yeah, that's the non-duality of duality and non-duality, as I was explained. Again, can be very theoretical. But it's also an actual experience. We just put words to it, like the experience of emptiness. Right. This is sort of, how could that be an experience if it's empty? So you're always going against this paradox, it would seem.
It sounds very theoretical, but to chop wood, you and the axe have to be different and the same at the same time in roughly the appropriate proportions. So it can also be very visceral, very straightforward, very practical.
Right. So it's we're not trying to be a homogeneous one. Well, we talked about that already. Yeah. That's great. Okay. So I think we really come from the same place in terms of how we see these things, at least theoretically. But then there's the whole aspect of practice, and then our daily experience, and where we're at in that realm. And so I guess one question I might ask you is, like, how would you give people, going through doing these practices, trying to understand all this stuff, how would you give them feedback? Because we need feedback, right? Otherwise we don't know anything. We can become so incredibly deluded by spiritual experiences or any kind of experience. I was just talking to a bunch of people who had all of these, were in Borderland, and which is sort of the European Burning Man, and they were talking about all these incredible experiences they had, and I could feel that it's like, okay, you've had all these incredible experiences, but you might be in danger now because you don't know how to integrate them, and you don't have a context, and you don't have anybody to talk to about what they mean. And so how do you help people with that?
Yeah, and obviously there's a limitation to what you can do in a digital format. So one of the reasons we've added these fireside sessions as well is so that people can have a little bit more time to exchange this stuff. In the main course, the most important thing, I think, is for people to check these things out personally and then be able to speak openly in front of each other about what they went through. And you'll get some co-challenging, you'll get some co-validation, you'll hear yourself. And that's about as much as you can do in 90 minutes. If you've already had some instruction, you've already gone through these practices. But then we can come together in these other sessions for people who are ready for it and talk more generally and receive some more direct feedback. And so one of the things you're going to try to give them feedback on is just asking them, to distinguish between what went well and what didn't go well, because we have a tendency to be monological as beings, right? It was all good or it was all bad. And just asking the question of what was the best part and what was the worst part automatically gets their mind functioning with a little more nuance. And they can then see patterns across a variety of moments of practice where some things tend to work well for them and some things tend to not work well for them. Then they can build up a wisdom of practice. But if the thing we call a practice is taken as itself homogeneous, then there might be a lot of feedback information we actually can't get from people or can't give to people, because they're thinking, okay, like say someone's doing transcendental meditation, and then they want to know, should they keep doing it or not? And you're like, well, first of all, you have to tell me what specifically you're doing. Let's take the notion of transcendental meditation or witnessing or whatever it is and break it into some pieces, because some of them might work for you and some of them might not. And if they're all stuck together in a conglomerate, then you may not be able to make any progress. And anybody who gives you feedback, it'll sound like they're either verifying or critiquing that whole conglomerate.
Right.
So
because people are attached to the conglomerate and they make it into an ideology of some kind, or, it's like, this is my thing, this is what I believe in, and all that sort of thing. So it's hard for people to, let's say, step outside of their own perspective and experience of those sort of things. And or when, I don't know, things become beliefs, don't they? Things become cultish beliefs.
And a lot of that is the wrong mixture. So maybe you remember these things to be like, Fruit Loops is part of this healthy breakfast, right? It would be like some meat and some fruit and some water and some milk and then Fruit Loops. And you're like, okay, it is part of that healthy breakfast, but in itself, it's not necessary. It's a completely unhealthy part of that. So then if you're going to give feedback on, well, is this or is this not a healthy breakfast? Is this process working or not working? A lot of the time people are attached to it because they know there's something good in there. And so they can't throw away the whole sack of things because there's definitely something in there that they like. And you have to be able to tease those parts apart so that they can start to throw away the bit that isn't working and keep the parts that they were attached to, because they might be attached to it for a good reason.
For a good reason,
yeah. Attachment is spread over some other things that aren't really necessary. And also, I mean, a large part of wisdom cultivation is just pointing people towards the development of nuance in their feelings, affects, and perceptions. So anytime you can ask for a more careful discerning of the bits, I think you're helping someone.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah. So what is the breakfast of champions then, spiritually speaking? What is that? What do we need to do? Maybe can you give us like the essential layman recipe, or the essential layman ingredients?
Well, I think when the Buddhists point to Shamatha and Vipassana, they're telling us something important. They're saying your practice has to have mind, skill, and coherence building practices, and it also has to have self-inquiry practices. I think they both play off each other and make each other stronger, but I think you need to be doing both of them. You need to be doing practices where you intentionally decide on what attention is going to do, so you become the more effective executor of attention. But you also have to have practices where you let attention go wherever it wants, and then you meet that, you deal with whatever it wants to bring you, and you learn something about yourself, or you deconstruct what it's brought to you, something like that. So those are two important forms of practice. I'd also point again to somatic interoception is a really important part of this.
Yeah, you said that a couple of times. You want to define that for people?
Sure.
Interoception. What does that word mean? I'm not sure if I'm familiar with
something inside yourself.
Okay.
So you're perceiving, imagine just feeling all over the whole inside of the body, right? Which very often has a kind of tingly sensation, right? We know we have a hand, but are we really inhabiting our hand, so to speak? So there are ways to practice feeling inside our body. And we want to be able to spread that and generally get information from the whole inside of our body all the time. Cellular, organ, proprioception, what are our muscles doing? There's a whole lot of intelligence there. And there's a whole lot of presencing that's possible just by knowing that we have this additional capacity for information. our nervous system can tune itself to pick up the inner experience of the body more and more competently. And people that do that tend to have more success in spiritual practices.
Why?
I think a large part of it is the fact that they're receiving more information about how it's going for them, so they can attune themselves or navigate more competently, right? They've got 10 bits of information instead of 3 about how it's going for them. But another part of it is their presencing, right? We have these dimensions and we want them to enter consciousness. We want to show up more authentically, and you can't show up authentically very well if several major dimensions of your experience are not being added into consciousness in the present moment.
Yeah. Well, what about sensitivity? I'm asking this because I was thinking about my own experience, and I was thinking about how when I lived in a monastery for a year, and then I tried to come back to the world, and I was completely unprepared. It was like an energetic shock to me, because I'd become so attuned and so sensitive that I was dysfunctional in some kind of a way. And I wonder if, like, so how do we navigate like our sensitivity, and then just the brutal realities of life, and having to, having to live in this world? Because I've known a lot of people that are kind of too sensitive for the world, and then other people who are just utterly insensitive, and there's a spectrum, and I want to protect the people who are sensitive on some level, because I think they see more, but at the same time they're fragile. Or
a lot of it's context and a lot of it's phase, right? People go through these different moments, and maybe it's appropriate for them to be more sensitive for a little while when something's come up and they've been sensitized, right? So then they need to be a little bit more protected until they can calm down and become more active and more robust about it. But whatever we're doing to help them in their sensitivity has to also be something which affords them the opportunity to become more grounded, more robust, more resilient, right? So we can think about it with children, right? Obviously, a baby is extremely sensitive. It has very little capacity to exist in the world. It's hyper responsive to everything that's going on. Little thing goes wrong and its body melts into trauma like it's in hell.
Yeah.
But so what we want to do is legitimately protect and nourish that thing. And once it's protected and nourished, we want to provide it every possibility to be appropriately challenged from its position of nourished, protected status.
Right.
And so we have to have both of those in mind all the time, because the goal is not to be sensitive. The goal is to be perceptive and robust. So we have to be able to protect sensitivity and also encourage anti-fragility at the same time. And that'll look a little bit different from moment to moment.
Of course. Yeah. So I don't know if this is a segue necessarily, but I was thinking about your last your last session, and it's called Grief and Apocalypse. And then you wrote this article called I forget what it was called, but where you talked about us being apocalyptarians, and and I've been thinking a lot about this word apocalypse, and how, and then you also use the word tragic optimism. So I like that as well. I like this fact that the apocalypse is also the revelation, and the tragedy is also the beginning of maybe a genuine optimism instead of a naive optimism.
Yeah, that goes along with becoming more robust, I think, right? We have to be able to lean into disconcerting affects. We have to do that voluntarily. If people force it on us, it doesn't work very well. So we have to get the idea that it would be good to feel some of these things. And these things include death, they include suffering, they include internal friction, but they also include maybe the doom of civilization, maybe the doom of the ecosystem, maybe the absolute rupture with the sacredness of the past. We're not sure what it might include, but it could be a tremendous failure, a tremendous death, a tremendous cutting off. And what would that be like, right? So to have our hearts break around existential risk, around the modern dilemma, around the meta crisis, I think this is really important, right? What we've got is all these ancient human tendencies, game A tendencies, amplified by modernity to the point where it accomplishes planetary crisis. We're now in an age of ongoing planetary crisis. And how do we show up for that? Well, we don't show up for that by denying it. right? We don't want to be overloaded and depressed and just fearful to the point of dysfunction, but we should let ourselves feel really bad, heartbreak, grief, to go all the way down into the negative affects, into the emotional shit and muck that's down there, so that we can accept what is and come back up as people who are tragically optimistic, who aren't naively assuming it's just going to work out, but nonetheless, they have the energy to participate in trying to make a better world. But they have that energy because they were willing to be broken by it. They were willing to let it go. And now they can return to full engagement. And this is this is a great Nietzsche question, right? It's in The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, where he talks about the tragic age of the Greeks and all of this energy to change history and to invent new genres of science and activity we associate with the Greeks. It didn't come in that little golden age of Socratean rationality. It came from the previous phase when all of them were just watching these awful plays where every hero is doomed and the gods go mad and everyone's torn to pieces and you reach your own doom by trying to escape your doom. The tremendous and enforced cultural pathos took them into a really dark place, but that dark place didn't hold them. It allowed them to pass through and become full of an energy that we look back on now as a tremendous generator of cultural power and renaissance. So if we're going to generate something like an effective renaissance, an effective religiosity in the network age that causes these planetary crises to stand out, we've got to take them seriously. We've got to be wounded by it, but that's in order to show up fully.
We got to be wounded, but what is a genuine wound, spiritual wound, let's say, and then a sentimentality of or getting hyped by what all this news that we're getting. And so when you say this, I have a feeling of yes and no. I feel yes, yeah. There's the certainly that is there. It's already there. The brokenheartedness is already there because we're living through this time. But when I feel like that's being imposed on me from outside, I get suspicious.
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons. It's got to be organic, authentic, and voluntary. The same as remorse. I've been really stressing remorse with people lately because there's this sense of a higher level of integration and integrity that you can get by allowing your values and your behavior to really fight with each other. You go, holy shit, we all behave in ways that don't match our hopes for our behavior, but we frequently don't touch the friction, the uncomfortable sensation that goes along with that. And there are other people that seem to want us to, right? Other people, society wants you to feel guilty, wants you to feel ashamed, all these sorts of things. That's not particularly helpful, right? So you need to set up some kind of membrane that holds that stuff off, holds off the signals from the social surface. You have your own space. And from your own space, like that protected baby, now you can reach out for the challenges. And you go, maybe I want to voluntarily suffer the inadequacy of my past actions. Maybe I want to voluntarily feel worse about, oh my God, the oceans are dying, the air's fucked up, we got accelerating convergent problems from all directions, no one knows what AI is going to do. These are things we always hear about, but we hear about them as part of the static stress of the social surface.
Yes, so the static stress of the social surface. I like that.
Have an internal container that can hold that at bay. And from that safe space, then go, hey, I voluntarily agree. I'm going to intentionally allow myself to feel worse about this and let my system go through whatever natural grieving process is available to it and not whatever somebody else or the news thinks I should be feeling.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to go very far to find the apocalypse, do you? You just have to see the shadow and the expression of somebody's face or walk into a grocery store or notice what's happening to your body as you age. And this is like, that's the apocalypse also, right? Just in your own process of falling apart.
It could be all over. You can go, wow, the birds aren't what they used to be in my town, or right. Could be something you hear as a piece of cultural information. I had this experience last year, year before, whenever it came out with Bo Burnham's special Inside.
What's that?
He's just in his apartment during COVID making all these fragments of comedy songs. And one of the songs had a line in it where he said, 30,000 years of this, 7 more to go. And I was off guard, and it hit me, and I started to weep. Right. I thought, and in that weeping, I felt, I know that I'm not taking seriously enough the situation that the whole
yes. Again, back to Gurdjieff. So many of Gurdjieff's expressions are the terror, the horror and the terror of the situation, he calls it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're all always in a rough situation, right? Which is death and disaster and bad luck lurk around every corner. But now the existential system of the human species and its life worlds are in that same risky situation. And the amount that would be lost and the amount of unnecessary suffering for sentient beings under those conditions, that's overwhelming. We can't take it all in, but we can lean into it a little more on purpose and be changed. But like you're saying,
exactly,
made sure it's not some superficial social static imposition.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I like about this Buddhist practice of Tonglen, which is different than the New Age. Tonglen is like you decide to take in suffering of other beings on an imaginative level. It's sort of rather than you decide to become a being of light, it's really going against the grain of your habitual sort of survival of the fittest.
There's a mixture of goodness and suffering that the Buddhists do that really well. Right after I do this course in September, then there's going to be an in-person metamodern goodness retreat in Vermont that I'm going to lead. Right, and so one of the questions around how do you develop moral intelligence and how do you build goodness in the kind of world we're living in, where skepticism about what people say is good is completely justified. Right, we have to be skeptically good. But it does involve a certain amount of being willing to suffer, being willing to see and feel the suffering of others, but also to understand that that's something you might want to do, that it's something you might experience as good. Tonglen's like that too, right? You go, it's not just, oh my God, I'm breathing in misery. I'm breathing in misery, and for some reason, I've been led to.
You need to do that. Good. Yeah, it might be what you need to do, because we're so blocked from actual feeling. Like maybe you're not, but we need to put up protective. We need to put on our armor. We get out in the morning, we put on our armor, steel armor. Every day we go out and clunk around. But there's some part of us that really needs to I think touch into that. So it's a sweet sadness, as Shakespeare would call it, rather than there is a sweet sadness about existence that is curative, I think, or
Yeah, I love that armor, because one of the features is a lot of this is embodied. A lot of this is physiological, as Reich and the subsequent generations of practitioners have pointed out. It's not abstract to feel sad. You have to be able to do it, right? Your musculature, you can't have your physical heart constricted, your physical breathing constricted, your physical motions. They have to be able to do the sacred sadness performance, the sacred heartbreak grieving performance. If it's holding itself together, you won't be able to go through that process properly. And there may be times where you have to have your armor on to go to battle. But when you come together with people to appreciate what the world condition is now, we have to be able to take off some of that armor. And some of that's just physically opening and loosening and breathing a little more thoroughly, so that we're available to the stimulations that go along with the dark affects that allow us to process the kind of world we're in.
Yeah, and that's what you do in a Sangha situation, is you take off your armor. Because you'd be stupid if you weren't wearing your armor, as you go through the world, because you need it. You need to protect yourself. But then there are moments when you get together with people, beloved people who have a high level, have a good, let's say, have goodwill and are intelligent, and then you can take off your armor and be sincere which doesn't
Thus,
mean you're going to be pretty all the time or clear. Yeah, that's another word. So much Gurdjieff is coming. It's amazing how, because I don't always think about Gurdjieff, but it's amazing about how so many axioms of how I think about reality I've borrowed from Gurdjieff.
Yeah, I think he's still, I mean, and I'm glad that I'm going to come on and talk about him.
Yes.
There's a lot of pieces of the new Dharma that he's holding space for, right? He's very traditional in some ways, but a lot of the ways we need to reformat our thinking for how the Dharma shows up in the world, he was onto those. He was hinting at those. He was making use of those. Not all of them, but there's a treasure trove of practices and insights and ways to embrace the awakening and souled, deeply human being that's still in that. And it's like it's been put in an ark or something, right? Yeah. Yes, there are Gurdjieff groups and lineages, but by and large, it hasn't really seeped into the world yet. It's still, I think, waiting to come, right? There's several.
Probably, yeah. And in a way, how I characterize it as like a spiritual genius is somebody, he gives you solid concepts to work with, like he gives you real things to work with. And once you've learned those things, you can't forget them. You can't deny them. They have almost, a permanence to them or something.
Well, that process, I don't know if we're off topic or not. That process of deep assimilation is so essential to anybody's ongoing spiritual life as a member of a community or as an individual, right? You can hear a piece of wisdom, but it doesn't matter unless it becomes a part of you. Right? Just like food, you could put food in your mouth and chew it up and have it fall out of your mouth. It doesn't do anything. You have to really tear this thing to pieces and subject it to your own chemicals and move its bits around in different parts of your body so that it becomes part of your flesh. And that process has been so uninspected, right? We have all of these educational processes to deliver knowledge and skills training. We don't really have much consideration about what constitutes understanding. Right? What constitutes the ability of a human being to more deeply assimilate information, proverbs, spiritual teachings, their own experiences, intensities of feeling? How do you make things part of you so that you can go ahead as a richer being? That's a really uninspected, basic existential question, which Gurdjieff stuff constantly puts in people's face.
Yes, right. It's about digesting impressions and how we do that. Yeah. So one thing you talk about metamodernism, and I did a podcast last night with Cal and Owen, and there was kind of a boisterous critique of metamodernism because those and I kind of got into it with them, and I said that the reason I'm not in love with the term yet is that I don't trust what's modern, because what's modern hasn't gone through the tests of time and deeds. So that was kind of my critique of metamodernism, and I don't want to have it in absolute. I don't want to be on some kind of like anti-modern crusade. I'm sure there's a lot of. But maybe you can try to sell that term to me a little bit, because I thought you might have an intelligent version of it.
Yeah, and it's perfectly good to be skeptical of all these terms. None of them are really going to apply. They're all temporary signifiers for circulating.
Or a neologism of some sort, which I go,
direction. Right? There's a lot to be said for the kind of aspirational positivity of metamodernism and Game B, but at the same time, you can't go ahead without the tragic suspiciousness associated with dark Renaissance and things like that.
Yes.
We need all of these things in the mix, and they should be challenging each other. And largely, we need a circulating set of general terms for whatever it is altogether. Clearly, we're not just talking about Ken Wilber's integral theory, but there's something about integration or being integrated or bringing things together. Clearly, we're not just talking about like the cultural theory of metamodernism, but there's something about we clearly want to talk to people who are not trapped in pre-modern, modern, or postmodern mentalities.
Why are people so clinging on to this term? Why is it sticking for so many people? Why are people so attracted to that term?
I think the reason it's for two reasons. First of all, they're attracted because they don't know what it means, right?
Right, exactly. So it's just
we're trying to language something that's on the tip of our collective tongue, and we want to put it in a box where it doesn't look like that box is full of too much shit already. But we know what we don't want in that box. We don't want that box to contain people who are fanatically identified with pre-modernism and reject everything about contemporary society.
Total traditionalism, and we don't want that.
Total modernists who think liberal progress is the solution to everything and we just need more technology, right? Who have no ability to receive a critique of modernity at all. We don't want those people in the box. And we don't want the kind of superficial, anti-human, anti-spiritual, postmodern reactionaries that we've seen too much of over the last 100 years. We don't want them in the box either. So we want a term that says.
So metamodernism is the box that that you put where you put the thing. It's like neti, not this, not that, not this, not this.
It's the box that doesn't have those other three things in it, although it can steal things from them if it wants to.
It's a box. So it's you're defining metamodernism by its lack of having any thing, just by it's a negative kind of definition. It's not these things. So that's why it's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, what is it?
Well, you could look at, once you got that box established, then you put a bunch of people or let them self-select to get into that box. And then you have a look at them and you see if there's any general patterns. Well, there's a general pattern of developmental stages in this box. Some of the people in this box are like, well, this is Piagetian internal transformation of cognition. And other people are in this box saying like, no, it's just adaptation to media and technology over different historical epochs. But this long evolving story in which there were distinct modes of being in the world for individuals and for societies, that looks like it's scattered throughout the box quite a bit. This sense in which we need to be more skeptical and also more sincere, that's in the box, sincere irony. The sense in which not only are science and religion not different, but they're kind of the same thing if you do it right, that's in the box. The sense in which we have to be able to show up as our differences, right, as our ethos, as our race, as our gender, as individuals, but that's never really enough. We essentially have to be doing all of that transparently to some broader context. The sense that we have to be able to inherit the archaic nature of human beings, but also be at the edge where humanity is being transformed into something much stranger. I think that's in the box. And I think the sense that there's some way to weave together all the different genres of human activity more successfully is in the box. Science and art and psychoanalysis and sexuality and magic, and right, that these things all.
Well, that's what I thought was a better definition of tantra. To go back, is tantra means to weave many different strands of things together than saying it's this and this and this, saying it's psychoanalysis and sex. Anyway, that's the.
So you could have. I mean, one other way to say it is like this box contains an emergent tribe of people, a meta tribe, which are sensitive to new tantric shamanism.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah,
but we can call it something
No,
else.
that was a good defense of metamodernism. And so I'm often find myself in this middle, in the middle of warring tribes and sort of the diplomat on the edge. Is like when I'm talking with those guys, I'll go into their critique, and then when I'm talking with the metamodernists, I'll go, yeah.
Well, that's according to Bard.
Maybe that's oscillation. Maybe that is maybe that makes me a metamodernist because I oscillate between different tribes and views. And all right. So, is there anything more you want to say about your course, or?
No, just go to Parallax and sign up for it. It's going to be really interesting. I think it's at the emerging edge of where we collectively are, both socially and technologically and spiritually.
Cool.
Maybe the
But you
link, if you
and
can't
you
find the link, just Google non-duality, parallax, and courses. You'll find it.
yeah, of course I will put a link in the description.
And I'm really looking forward to the
so,
Parallax Sangha, and I think it's great that that's coming forward now for everyone.
yeah, I think we have to make a community. We have to. I think that a platform has to be a community at the same time. It can't be just giving out information. For the reasons you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, the mycelial, the networking, and we have to do something with these little mushrooms that are popping out of the earth. So maybe that's what Parallax Sangha is, a mushroom that's popping out of the earth, a mycelial formation.
The metamycelium.
Yes, the metamycelium. That's very good.
Oh.
Cool. So I think yes.
My subtitle for this thing in my own mind is Deus ex mycelia, like God from the machine, but it's God from the mycelium, right? It's the syntheos out of the mycelial web, where we're vetting each other and finding each other and growing into whatever this new thing is that we're creating.